Hello. That's a little bit much. All right. You might remember Kristina was here a couple years ago. She was very pregnant, has a 2-year-old now, adorable little girl. Kristina Sargent joined the Middlebury College Department of Economics in the fall of 2017 after completing her PhD in economics at the University of Colorado Boulder. She holds a BA in International Affairs and Political Science, also from the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research focuses on using theoretical models to better understand the impacts of complex interactions of individual behavior on the broader macro economy. Applications of her models have included the relationship between migration and labor markets in the European Union, the labor market impacts of Brexit, the role of the growing gig economy in conventional sector labor markets, colonial-era explanations for modern-day migration patterns, the role of women in labor markets, and the dual impact of trade and automation on high and low wage labor in the U.S. That's all. This girl's doing nothing. 2-year-old she has. She teaches courses in macroeconomics, the economics of the European Union, international politics, and economic history. Give a warm welcome to Kristina Sargent.
Okay, yeah? Perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me back. As I was revisiting my slides from last time, I realized it was almost exactly 2 years since I was here last, and I feel very different since then. I sleep less now. I'm so excited to be here today. I do a lot of various things of my research, but I don't do a lot with Europe lately. And so it's really nice to be able to come back to something that was really foundational for me in becoming an economist and what I do and the way I think about the world. So it's always nice to be reminded of, the beginnings. I'll say my plan for today is briefly, I'm going to tell you why I think this is an important topic as separately from the news lately. And mostly I'm going to frame this as a series of challenges that the EU is facing. And then I'll sort of try and make some more broader statements about, the world as part of this. I'm a professor. I am very used to being interrupted all of the time. So if you have clarification questions or big substantive questions that you want to stop and talk about, I'm very happy to do that. I can also just talk about this forever. So feel free to interrupt me wherever. I'm really planning on being done around 2:45, 2:50 maybe. So we can have more Q&A toward the end. So why am I talking about the challenges facing the EU? And really the reason I think this is important is because throughout history we see crises and challenges as a catalyst for change and moving forward. And especially in the EU, it's as a catalyst for further integration. And that's where we see the solutions for the building blocks of the integration for the European project. So Jean Monnet in 1967, right after the founding of the European Steel and Coal Community, the very beginnings of the European Union, or what would become the European Union, has this somewhat famous quote for those of us who think about these things. And essentially he says, Europe will be forged in crises. Here he means Europe as a European Union, not as the continent. And it will be the sum of the solutions that are adopted for those crises. So even from the very beginnings of the European Union, we see that the founders, these driving forces, really viewed the foundations of their project as being in crisis. And you see that throughout the 20th century, right? From the beginnings of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, is a series of crises after 200 other years of crises on the European continent. You have the rise of communism, the post-communist revolutions, and then something that I always remind my students of, they never know about this, the domestic terrorist waves throughout the 20th century in Europe. You have the troubles in the 90s, I always tell my students to watch Dairy Girls on Amazon. I think it's a fascinating and really accurate portrayal of the normalization of violence in everyday life and how you sort of forget about this, and then there are these moments that really cut through everyday life. And it does it in a very entertaining way. So, but probably I don't need to tell many of you about these. The ETA in Spain, right? They have the series of subway bombings. You have the Red Brigades in Italy throughout the 70s and 80s, the RAF in Germany, and there's many others that we could talk about. At the same time, further in the east, you have the Balkan Wars, and then you have a series of civil wars, right? You have Czechoslovakia getting broken up, you have Yugoslavia getting broken up, and the UK, right? Dissolving in the Troubles, but also future sort of premonitions of them leaving the European Union. So I've sort of decided to structure this as two different types of crises that the EU faces. The first are a set of chronic crises that are sort of ongoing and they feel very blunt, even though they're incredibly important and like existential for the EU to figure out and face. And then a series of acute crises that are really much more focused on the 21st century and something that has to be dealt with immediately, or at least feels like it needs to be dealt with immediately. And so I'll go through these sort of sequentially. I have a lot of maps, so I think we'll get used to seeing different Europe maps here as a way to sort of visualize what's happening. So starting with our chronic crises, this is one representation from the European Commission of what kinds of climate crises the EU feels like they're going to be facing in the next 50 to 100 years. So I know that this is small, and so, but what you get is the pink areas are areas that are going to get warmer. The blue areas are going to get colder, interestingly. And the darker the shading, the worse the change is going to be. The darker the shading, the more people are concentrated there. And so you can see that there are these population centers like Paris and others in more Central and Eastern Europe that are going to be hit with increasing fires, extreme warming periods, drought and desertification, and some of these places are places with a lot of people. And so the idea here is that we need to do something about this, but these changes are happening slowly. So how do we get that kind of urgency to come through in something like this? Now, this is then contrasted with something that feels very silly. Well, or at least it felt very silly until maybe 10 years ago. This is one way to represent the democratic backsliding and sort of crisis of democracy in Europe. So we can see from the 70s to the 90s, you had some growth, a huge jump up in the liberal democracy index, judicial constraints index, legislative constraints, and the rule of law through Europe. Big jump with the fall of communism, and then slow but steady increases following that until around the European debt crisis, and you see backsliding. This is driven a lot by places like Hungary and Poland and right-wing governments coming in and sort of taking over the judiciary and leaning into what is now in Hungary an autocratic democracy. This is a problem for people in Europe viewing the legitimacy of their own governments, but also of the EU institutions. And so one of the things that Europe gets criticized a lot for is that, yes, it is collectively the largest economy in the world, but it's 27 member states with different voices. And so this is actually from, you can't see this, this is from the financial crisis, or really the eve of the Euro crisis. And it's depicting the United States saying, you know, things would really be better if Europe just spoke decisively as one, right? And in crisis, they all need help. The US mostly ignored this. But the problem is that each of these voices asking for help needs different kinds of help, right? And so despite needing a singular voice to be sort of unifying on the world stage, there's so much infighting and squabbling behind that they can rarely agree on anything other than help. The other problem here is with the institutions of the European Union themselves. So you have the European Council, which is sort of like the US president, right? This is made up of the 27 heads of state and government of each of the member nations. So this is, Macron in France, Merz in Germany. It was Angela Merkel. She sort of was the face of everything for a long time. But the problem is there is no Angela Merkel. Macron is trying very hard to fill that space. But despite trying, the rest of the EU is not falling in line behind him in the way that they did behind her. So the Council decides on issues that aren't resolved by the Council of Ministers, which is not the same as the European Council. These are the foreign ministers of each of those countries. You have the European Commission, which is sort of the legislative branch. They do a lot of the writing of the laws and deciding on the legislative agenda. This is led by Ursula von der Leyen now. People had really high hopes for her in her second term, not turning out to be this great watershed moment. She's somewhat absent on the international stage. And then you have the European Parliament, and if you thought the US Congress was a mess, this is 700 members of parliament from all over Europe that have to agree almost unanimously on everything. So there's a bit of a crisis of leadership in the institutions themselves. How do we get this to speak with one voice? If I knew, I would win the Nobel Prize. So now I want to think about the last chronic challenge. Perfect, okay. The last chronic challenge facing the EU, which is demography. And this is not unique to the EU by any means. In fact, the United States is seeing very similar pressures, as is a lot of the wealthy, developed world, which the World Bank doesn't like to use developed as a nomenclature anymore, but they haven't settled on the new one. So we're in transition here. But the reason this is a problem is because if we look at this, so the average change in median age, so the average age in each of these countries, these are sub-regions. So the change in the average age from 2019 to 2050 for the whole EU is 4.5 years. Maybe that's not so bad, but some places it's much larger, right? If you look at Spain, the average is going to increase by more than 8 years. So that's the average age going from 60 to 68. Other places, it's actually going to fall. So France, sort of north central Europe, southern Italy is aging very rapidly, as is northeastern Europe. When you have a large part of your population being older, you have an increase in what's called the old age dependency ratio. So what this is the number or the percentage of people who are over 65, so typically out of the labor force, compared to the number of people who are in the labor force. So the standard measure is 20 to 64 in Europe. And so we can see this is the predicted dependency ratio by 2050. So those places that we're going to age most, right, Spain, Central and Eastern Europe, you actually see the dependency ratio growing most in Spain. Does anybody know why this is? A bunch of people from here retire here because it's warm and sunny. Actually, and a lot of the young people are leaving Spain. The young people are leaving Spain and going to France and Germany and the sort of Nordics. So aging alone is not a crisis, right? We can see actually that the dependency ratio is not increasing dramatically in all of these places, right? It's declining in some of the places that are aging the most rapidly. And that's mostly because of migration. So we're expecting younger people to come into some of these places, mostly over here, from more Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa, but a lot of UK retirees going to Spain. that in and of itself is not so much a problem, but it is a problem for places that have generous welfare systems and social support systems for the elderly and out of the labor force. Because if you have fewer people working and paying into those systems compared to the number of people who are taking benefits out of those systems, you end up something like the Social Security problem we have in the United States, but with a very different cause, right? Here it's not because they're raiding the bank, it's because there are just so many people out of the labor force compared to those who are in the labor force. This is not a problem yet, but it is going to be a problem fairly soon. So if we think about the percentage change in the population as a result of an aging population, migration in and out, you have very different scenarios and outcomes based on whether you think about what happens with migration or not. So here on the left, this is what we think will happen with migration. So this is probably the more likely scenario, right? You have the Nordics growing, some emptying out of Southern and Eastern Europe. If we don't account for migration or we don't allow for migration, Europe will shrink by a lot. These darkest red areas are a 75% reduction in the population. This is because Europeans are not having babies. And if we don't have migrants come in, there will be no workers to replace the people retiring out of the labor force. This is a problem beyond benefits, right? If you don't have workers, you don't have stuff. You don't have food, you don't have consumables, right? You don't have restaurants staffed to go out to. Life changes dramatically. So, this is always a problem in my class too. It's like a major downer, right? My students this semester, every day we leave class and I'm like, okay, what's the good news? So, well, hopefully we get to that at the end. So, I guess the good news is they're actually making good headway on some of these things. So, as part of the COVID stimulus programs in Europe, they've instituted the new, the Regen EU and the new Gen EU programs to really tackle climate change in a substantial way, in a way that was very similar to Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which was really a climate bill. But the EU has for a long time been doing far more than the US has been in terms of investment in renewables, switching away from fossil fuels, working on putting in EV infrastructure, heat pumps, and alternative ways of housing and cooling both commercial and residential buildings. Is it enough in a sort of global crisis that doesn't, believe in borders? We don't know, but as the biggest, wealthiest economy on the planet, they feel like they have some responsibility to putting more contribution into this than, say, Africa. There's also the fact that they started the Industrial Revolution, so perhaps they should do something about it. The democratic backsliding, legitimacy, leadership, and institutional challenges is something that they've been aware of for a long time, but it's not clear what the solution to this is. One thing that I think is really sort of indicative of the leadership piece is I was in Manchester in August of 2022, so right before I came here last. Well, right before. And there were huge numbers of public works projects, big buildings and roads, that I happened to know were being funded by the European Union. Nowhere was that apparent on those projects, on the fences, on the advertisements. Nothing said that this was being funded by the EU after the UK had left, because these were projects that were started before they left. And the EU had committed those funds. They were paying for those new roads and those big buildings and the universities to be built. They were not advertising it. So maybe it's a PR thing. In terms of demography, we've had a lot of efforts at the local and sort of provincial levels in countries. It turns out that it's very difficult to have people have more babies. I was just listening to an article about a policy in China right now where you get, however many thousands of renminbi for having the first, second, and third child. But the third child, it was like less than half the cost of raising a kid. And that's your third one. And people are effectively saying, like, yeah, that bonus is great, but that's nowhere near reflective of the challenges we face as parents in terms of getting our kids prepared for success in this complicated world, feeding and housing them, right? Kid bonuses are not enough. Parental leave extensions are not enough, right? It's very complicated. Actually, Turin, Italy has had some success on this. They've instituted a combination of state-sponsored childcare, cohabitation across generations, so actually bringing daycares into senior centers and having sort of this cross-generational like interaction and appeal, and staff sharing. And they had a small increase in their fertility rate, but nowhere near what would be necessary to reverse what we're seeing there, right? So these are hard problems that the EU institutions are doing some things about. They're pouring billions of euros in, but they're not problems with clear solutions, right? And I think it's important to sort of contrast this with what the acute crises are. And so these I'm going to really focus on, say, the last 20 or so years. I didn't really want to talk about this last one, but I also felt like I couldn't not. So we're going to talk about it. So starting with the financial crisis, you might say, oh, this is 13 years ago. Why do we care about this still? Well, because some places are still not recovered from the financial crisis. So for example, by 2017, parts of Spain, Italy, Finland have not recovered their GDP per capita from before the financial crisis. Many of these countries, the orange ones mostly, right, only recovered in 2014 or later. So only in the past 10 years did they recover from the financial crisis. In many ways, the financial crisis was the deepest recession and the slowest recovery that we've seen, potentially even worse than the Great Depression was. It was exceptionally slow recovery from the financial crisis in the United States and in Europe. In terms of the migration crisis, right, it really peaks in 2015 with the just complete collapse of the Syrian regime. So we peak with over 100,000 asylum applicants per month in the EU in 2015 in August. This is now, I would say, closer to sort of 50,000 in some places in a bad surge, but this is not something that has gone away since 2015. And you can see, right, the places that get hit with the most of these refugees, Germany by far took in the most refugees from Syria and other northern African countries in 2015. Some people blame or credit Angela Merkel effectively saying, come, we'll take you. Hungary has a huge number of asylum seekers. France, slightly fewer. They're mostly from Syria, some from then Kosovo, Afghanistan, Albania, Iraq, and then Northern Europe and Russia, right? This has not gone away, but it has become less acute. By and large, migrants, especially asylum seeker migrants, are less likely to be engaged in the labor force. They have a harder time integrating into society, and part of this is due to schemes in some of these countries that spreads migrants out. So it distributes the burden of taking care of people on local principalities and things, but the problem is those people lose their networks. They lose their connections to other people. And when you just get planted into a new place, it's very difficult sometimes to acclimate, to learn the language, to figure things out without a safe place at home to recover from sort of the onslaught of the day. And so we've seen studies that show that places that have kind of small clusters of migrants, not necessarily like a full Chinatown type. The entire section of the city is from this migrant group. But neighborhoods, or even like a set of houses that's like a few families together, are far better off and more integrated into the labor market than migrants who are distributed all over the place. They're learning, they're getting better. But it takes time to learn these things, to do the studies, to understand what the scope of the problem is. Brexit, which I talked about last time, and actually has turned out to be not so bad for the EU. Not so great for the UK. But this was a big loss, right? In 2019, the UK was 13% of the population of the EU. It was 15% of the GDP, and they contributed 12% of the budget. So that was a lot of money that was no longer being contributed. Now, on the other side of that, the UK was also a big recipient of UK funds, so the money goes both directions. It's which groups get benefited, right? Estimates now show that the UK is probably 2 to 3% smaller than it would have been otherwise, which is big, right? When you consider GDP growth on average in Western countries is about 2%, that's an entire year of growth gone because of Brexit. The EU has been negligible. It's hard to estimate direct effects, partially because there's so many other things happening at exactly the same time. It's not a clean experiment, as my colleagues in empirical micro would say. But by and large, the EU has weathered the storm of Brexit remarkably well. And some would argue that this is because, as a result of Brexit, they banded together, they came together, they used that crisis for more integration. They negotiated as one single bloc. They didn't let the UK pick off members. And they came together in that moment. And they said, no, you're the one leaving us. That's your problem. And it has been their problem, right? The UK hasn't signed a single trade agreement with a country since they left. That's mostly because they lost all of their staff. Point of contention. Absolutely.
Where does the budget go? What is the common expenses?
Yeah, so the EU pays for a lot. The biggest proportion of their budget is called the Common Agricultural Policy, and this is farm subsidies for farmers. Most of that goes to wealthy, big farms, much like in the United States, but it does go to support things like milk prices. So anytime they try and cut the cap budget, dairy farmers in Belgium take their tankers into the central square in Brussels and dump milk all over, and it makes it smell horrible for like 3 weeks later. But much like in the United States, the farm lobby is incredibly powerful. So that's over half of the EU's budget is to agricultural funds. So the cap it's over half the total budget. Half of the cap budget goes directly to farms as subsidies, and the other half goes to sort of retraining and development, sustainability practices, that kind of thing. The rest of the budget pays for the European Defense Fund. It pays for a huge amount of research and development funds, and for development funds that mostly go to the Central and Eastern European countries to help them catch up to the West. But it mostly goes to farms. So Brexit turns out to have not been a terrible ordeal, maybe because of this integration through crisis that we sort of led off with. So next, COVID, right? I don't need to remind you guys how fun that was. But the reason I bring this up is because the impacts on the European economies from COVID were very different for different places. This was not a symmetric shock. So yes, everyone effectively got hit by this thing at the same time. Nobody understood what was happening. But there were places that were far better able to handle that shock than others. The thing that I want to point out here is the correlation in the places that had a hard time with the demographic challenges from before, right? So this is on the left female and on the right male. This is the spatial distribution of basically years of life lost in these European countries. And so sometimes this is due to lower standards for survivors, like if you were like chronically ill afterward, and this would also include deaths. And so effectively the message here is that men and women fared quite differently, right? Overall, women had less dark red is bad, right? And light blue is the best. Women had a far less severe experience of COVID compared to men, but also the Central and Eastern European countries and Spain and Southern Italy had a really hard time, right? And those are exactly the places that are aging the fastest, that have those highest increases in the age dependency ratio. So the places that are suffering from these crises the most are getting hit by several of them at once. It's not just everybody gets it, right? It's the severity is distributed heterogeneously, we would say in economics. It's not even. If we think about what happened to the overall size of the economy, right, which economists get hit all the time with how focused we are on GDP and money, but that's because that's highly correlated with other things we care about, like health and education and happiness and access to services and stuff. And it's also easy to measure and compare across time and space compared to those other things we care about, right? So yeah, we talk about GDP all the time, but not because that's the only thing we care about. So again, we can see the different heterogeneity here in terms of how big of a hit to the economy COVID was. So relative to 2019, so 2019 is when we start, everything is going to be compared to that. So everybody had a major hit for 2020 when the onset of COVID. Everybody had a big rebound, right? But everyone rebounded differently. So the places that had the biggest declines also had the smallest rebounds. So Spain, remember? From poor Spain, right? Spain has the biggest decline. They're still not recovered by the beginning of 2022. Italy does a little bit better, but not great, right? Only by the very beginning of 2022 are they even close to recovered. France is better. France has recovered by third quarter of 2021, and it has now grown beyond what they had done before COVID. The Eurozone is effectively right back on track. Germany's a little bit worse off. If we think about how that has played out looking to today, right? So you see everybody has that big hit, a very big recovery. This is relative to the previous year now. So this is, year-on-year growth. We have decline going into the last couple of years and very small growth hereafter. So these are sort of historical averages, right? Just above 2-ish%. But Germany this morning released figures. They're expecting their third year of zero economic growth this year. They're not shrinking, but they're not growing either. Now thinking about Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this is the estimated impact of the crisis on economic growth as a percent of GDP. So remember, if your average growth for the past 200 or so years has been 2%, a decline in growth rate of 1% is a cut in half of your growth rate for your entire economy. 0.5% is a quarter less, right? So you would be at 75% of your previous trend. So Russia, obviously, biggest hits in 23 and 24 out of everyone, which some would say is good, right? That's the point of the economic sanctions that most of the rest of the world has imposed to try and sort of deter them from further aggression. Not working so great in actually deterring the aggression, but at least their economy is not growing as fast. But the Eurozone and the UK are not doing well, right? They're suffering from 0.5 percentage point growth. In a country like Germany that hasn't grown in 3 years, that's a big reason why, right? This is a quarter of your growth just getting chopped off because you're dealing with war on the continent for arguably the first time since the 50s, since you started the European project. The US, more insulated, but again, it's not like we're growing incredibly fast. 16% less growth, 22% less growth, 17% less growth on a 2 percentage point growth rate is a big change. The rest of the world sort of looks like the United States, but the neighbors are much more affected. So that's the GDP, that's the size of the economy hit. But again, and I talked about this last time, right? It's like, this is actually affecting the people. So if we look at the actual personal human effects of this, this is just one way to count this. This is the non-EU citizens who left Ukraine, so specifically coming from Ukraine, going into Europe, who are under temporary protections. So at least temporary asylum, usually. Where are they? So these numbers you can't see, they're too small, which is too bad. But so the EU total is 4.3 million, which is almost 10% of the population. And this is not distributed evenly. Poland is getting the highest as a proportion of the population. Some of this is for cultural reasons. They feel strongly that we need to resist Russia and that these people should be protected. They have some historical experience in this area and are walking the walk now. Ukrainian refugees have been very warmly welcomed and integrated into Polish society, and many of them are planning to not leave ever again. They've taken almost 1 million on their own. Germany, by far, has taken the most in terms of total numbers at 1.2 million. These are not small numbers of people coming from Ukraine. Right, so this is at the end of February. These are the newest numbers I could find. But most European Union countries are taking in big numbers, right? Even France, which is in the lightest, that's less than 2.5 per 1,000 people, so not a big proportion of their population, have still taken 57,000 refugees. That's a lot of people who are displaced. So who are these people? They're mostly women, 18 to 64, and young kids, less than 14. And these numbers do not include less than 14 in France because France doesn't report them for protection. And so these are lower bound counts on minors. This is a huge portion of your labor force that has left Ukraine, right? That is not planning to return, for the most part. In surveys, many of them say they plan to stay if they'll be allowed to. So if we think the demographic problem is bad in Europe, Ukraine has a real catastrophe. Now we're moving into the thing I didn't want to talk about. So if the US walks away, like we have very recently threatened to do, the EU can make up the difference if they want to. So what this graph shows is what is needed as a percent of each country's GDP in order to make up for what the US would take away if we just left. And so some countries, if you say that everybody needs to, yes, we stopped sending any money, arms, anything.
So
we abandoned Ukraine, which is what's been.
So is this about Ukraine or is this about NATO or is this about?
This is about Ukraine.
Okay.
This is just Ukraine.
But okay, what if we ended the war?
They're still going to need money for rebuilding. I don't feel like the war is going to end in the next little bit, but maybe I'm wrong. So what this says is Europe is worried that the US will just walk away. And they are committed to seeing Ukraine through to success, to victory, whatever that sort of means. If they were to do that, what would it take? That's what this graph is trying to show. And so what it says is effectively what the US is currently contributing is about equal to 0.2% of Europe's GDP. So if every country contributes that average of their own GDP, that would sum up to what the US is vacating. Some countries are already doing way more than that. So Denmark, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Sweden, Finland, Norway, countries that are very close to Russia that have a big interest in not seeing Russia closer. Historically, these countries have been invaded by Russia before. They know what that was. They don't want to go back. They're already above target to replace what the US is providing. The rest of these countries would have to make up for, in some cases, a lot, right? Malta is contributing almost nothing currently. So from zero, they would have to devote about 0.2% of their GDP from almost nothing. On the one hand, Malta's GDP is not huge, right? It's as a fraction of the total, it's quite small. But if you consider this as the EU coming together as a force for integration, standing as one voice, everyone has to participate. And if you have countries like Malta, Cyprus, and Hungary in particular not participating, that undermines the whole project. But I think this is actually a positive figure, right? What it says is that the whole is not that enormous. Europe can do this. They can afford to if they want to. And that actually makes me feel a lot better, because I don't know what's going to happen with American policy generally. And so to me, this is good news, right? It means that yes, we are important, but we are not necessary. We are sufficient. But Europe can do this on their own. So now moving into the tariff wars. This I think is fun because this really shows what policymakers think people care about. So the US said, okay, no single malts from Ireland, no pecorino cheese. Pecorino specifically? I don't know. Cashmere sweaters. Americans must love these, right? French wine, big one. What is the EU going to put tariffs on? Orange juice, bourbon, because Kentucky, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, and peanut butter. You have to laugh because otherwise, what are you going to do? But so this was the 25% retaliatory sort of back and forth that was being floated prior to April 2nd. On April 2nd, Trump put in effectively a 20% blanket tariff on European Union countries, except Switzerland. They get like 31% because apparently we really don't like their watches. And these 4 other countries are candidate countries. So they are not currently members of the EU. This is Europe on a whole. This is not just EU. But Switzerland is the only member state that is not at that just standard 20%. They get the extra 11 for mystery reasons. When you look at the methodology that was released for how these were calculated, it was effectively put into place to eliminate the trade deficit. So effectively, the mystery reasons are that we really buy a lot from Switzerland in value. Our trade deficit with Switzerland is bigger than it is for other EU countries. This is complicated by the fact that the EU does not individually negotiate trade agreements with other countries. On trade, they are one. They have one single common external tariff. So if Trump wants to negotiate with these countries individually on his trade policy, they cannot return with trade promises, right? They can only promise non-trade benefits to the United States in return for reductions in tariffs. And the EU as a whole has to unanimously agree on what the collective EU response will be. So when Giorgia Meloni, who's the Prime Minister of Italy, was in DC last week, or the week before, I forget, Trump repeatedly brought up trade policy. And she had to remind him over and over again that she cannot legally negotiate trade with him. She has zero authority. Zero. That's not her purview. That's the EU. And just to give a sense of exactly how unprecedented this is, the last time the US had an average tariff level anywhere near 20% was 1930 with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that are unequivocally thought to have been a bad idea and extended the Great Depression by at least several years. This is unique. There's not much historic precedent going back to, like literally 1900, over 100 years ago. So, lots of crises, but also lots of opportunities for coming together, for forging this project to create a common good, right? Europe came out of World War II literally destroyed physically. And as part of these series of crises they've undergone in the last 75 years, they've become the world's biggest economy. And a role model for how to think about climate change. And that, I think, is the positive takeaway here, right? Is like, Europe is just one crisis after another. And they've managed to turn that mostly into force for good. So I think it's not as bad as it might seem. So I'm going to end there. Hopefully, we definitely have time for questions. I can also stay a little bit later. Thanks so much for listening. Ooh. And you're welcome to email me anytime. I'm happy to talk. Don't call me, though. I'm a millennial. I'm not going to answer the phone.
All right, someone over here has a question.
Do you feel the nation-state system is weakening and that banks, corporations, and other non-nation-state players are exerting more control over the entire world?
Starting off easy there. Yes and no. So I think it's very easy to see why you could make that argument, right? You hear all about lobbying and the way that financial decisions get made, but I think some of that is a product of better news, more accessible news. If you think back to, right, the era of Andrew Carnegie and Ford, they were actually making US foreign policy at that time. If you look at pre-Civil War US, cotton manufacturers and textile mills in the northern seaboard were making foreign trade policy on cotton cloth and exports. So you could test that empirically. I don't know. I really don't know. I think you could make an argument either way.
I may have a similar question. Trump prefers to negotiate unilaterally rather than multilaterally, whatever. And yet, and he's meeting individually with these different European countries.
Yep.
Do you feel like he is trying to split up the European Union through all of this tariff negotiations?
I mean, that's absolutely what he would prefer, right? Because he can make one-off decisions, deals with these countries that are more beneficial to him than he can with them as a bloc. But the thing is that at this point, that's not their choice. They really have no authority in trade policy as individual countries anymore. If he wants to have a trade negotiation, it has to happen with Ursula von der Leyen. He can make other deals, right? And he can say, you know, make promises that you're going to send your factories and build factories in the US, but they can't make promises about trade and tariff rates. I have no idea what message he's getting. I have no idea if he knows that or if he cares, right?
If we go back to the founding of our own country in the Revolutionary War and the Articles of Confederation, the big problem that created the urge to have our current Constitution was that individual states weren't willing to ante up for the obligations to pay for our winning our independence, War of Independence. Could you care to comment on the current organization of the EU in relation to this issue and where you think they might be heading?
So I actually think that Trump is great for European unity. If you look at polls, so the Europeans and their data are just fantastic. So Eurostat is their statistical agency. They collect all the data from all the nation states, and they have a subset of their people is called the Eurobarometer. And they run these surveys across the entire EU twice a year and ask them all these questions about how they feel. And through Trump 1 and then again now, people's support of the EU project, of the EU institutions, have skyrocketed. So they support a stronger Europe. They support stronger defense spending. They want more Europe. Well, they tell pollsters they want more Europe. The Germans just voted in a very pro-Europe government. Poland just got rid of their sort of far right, but they're having problems because the judiciary was captured by the previous regime, and it's quite difficult to legally recalibrate your entire judicial system. So we're seeing Poland coming back, but it's taking a while. Germany just voted to get rid of their debt brake in order to finance huge amounts of investment in defensive spending. Poland is they're on track to spend 5% of their budget on defense, so well above the NATO requirements or averages. People are pro-Europe right now. I think it's very good. It's sort of similar to what you see in Canada with Trudeau leaving and Mark Carney coming in as the leader of the Liberals. They had no chance 6 months ago. They were going to get demolished by the Canadian Conservative Party. And now, the Conservatives might get 40% of the vote. So, at our expense, the rest of the West seems to actually be strengthening sort of liberal democracy. At a high cost. But I think, yeah, the support for Europe has gone up since Trump was reelected.
Hi, I was just wondering, I was really impressed with how Europe was able to wean itself off of Russian gas and oil, but that's just an impression. Have you looked at that in terms of were they actually successful at that or how it impacted their economies?
Yeah, so I already had 31 slides, and I was like, I'm not going to get through 31 slides in 45 minutes. So I didn't show that. So they're not completely off Russian fossil fuels. Some countries have entirely cut off flows. Other countries less so. Slovakia and Hungary in particular are really fighting it, partially because they're incredibly dependent on it and it's expensive to switch over. It also takes time, right? So a lot of these countries have to put in liquefied natural gas terminals to get brought in from the United States and to build a liquefied natural gas terminal and then also the infrastructure to get that gas to the rest of your country. It takes time in a place with permitting and things like that, right? A lot of that is primed to come online in the next 3 to 5 years, but it's expensive. And Europe has a chronic problem with excessive deaths during cold winters, so we've gotten lucky. The past couple winters haven't been too bad, which has helped a lot. And then like heat pump technology has improved a lot and helped that too. So yes, they've been incredibly successful at substituting away from Russian gas sources, not entirely, and not all in like the green way, right? There's been substitution back to coal. For example, Germany brought back one of their nuclear plants back online, which is debatable how green that is depending on how you count things. But separate from that, yeah, Europe was hugely reliant on Russian gas and other fuels before the invasion, and now they're very small proportion of the source.
Hi. So if I'm wrong, but I think that for economists always talk about a country's health in terms of their growth.
Yep.
So my question, if that's true, my question is that an endless goal? Are we supposed to grow forever? And if we are, what's a healthy or ideal rate of growth? Do we ever get to a point where we say, we're good, our economy is good, and we're just going to stay here? Or does that not happen?
So this is very apropos. Right? The economists are having a lot of discussions about this and big debates. And so there's one team that says, we absolutely cannot do this. It is fully unsustainable for the planet and other resources. And thinking about the way that we have used resources in the past. We just cannot do this, right? We've destroyed the planet in the process from the Industrial Revolution to today. There are other people who say, well, yeah, growth for growth's sake is not what the idea is here. But it is the case that I tell my students, humans are like raccoons, right? We like shiny things and we like lots of it. And so I think it would be difficult to tell, like, so in the United States, for example, right, we probably have enough. Most of us do, right? Like, do I need another blazer? Probably not, right? But it is also the case that there is a lot of the rest of the world that doesn't have enough. Okay. Sure. So I think growth that is fueled in the current means of production is not sustainable. But I don't think that a self-respecting economist would say that we're assuming that the means of production don't change, right? There's a huge transition to a circular economy in which we can still have growth, but we're using resources in a different way. And I think that's where a huge amount of research is going right now, is how do we make our lives better, more efficiently with the resources we have, right? And I think there's a hesitation in some part as like the knee-jerk reaction is like, okay, we're not Malthus, right? Malthus is super famous for the like, like life is nasty, brutish, and short, and any kind of growth has only been short-lived, and so we grow at our own peril. And then he died, and then we had the Industrial Revolution, and he looked very silly. And so I think there is a hesitation to fall into like a Malthusian thinking trap. Like just because this is the way we've been doing it since the 1700s or so doesn't mean that this is the only way that we could do it. And I think there are lots of very thoughtful conversations and work going into how to do this better. How do we make people better off more efficiently from a natural resources perspective?
Anyone else? Kristina, this was fabulous. Thank you so much.